The facts show that our genetic programmer purposely disabled the big code and left us to exist on only 3% of our DNA. Like a broken radio dial which is stuck on one station instead of roaming across thousands of stations and frequencies, humans are stuck on one station called five-sense reality. Genesis, which means origin, is the name of the first book of the Bible. The true origin of the human race is coded right into the very word itself. Genesis is gene Isis, the gene of Isis. Since Isis and Venus are one and the same goddess, the gene of Isis is actually the gene of Venus. The genesis of the human race is the gene of the gods of Venus.
Hi, my name's Crystal. I graduated from Texas A&M University with a degree in agricultural leadership and development with emphasis in genetics and biochemistry. I also researched in several labs on campus in genetics. And today I'm going to talk about some very interesting facts about genetics that you probably don't know. Now, you probably think that the human genome size is rather large, which it is because we are a very complex mammal. In fact, it will fill up 90 volumes of an Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, why don't we compare that to something else? Let's say a lily seed. A lily seed actually is bigger than our genome. Its genome would fill up 1,800 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, we normally think that the human genome is this huge, vast information. But actually, if we converted it into binary code, the human genome is just slightly larger than that of the storage capacity of a CD-ROM. As a matter of fact, Windows XP is twice as large as our human genome. So the human genome actually requires 750 megabytes of storage, whereas Windows XP would require 1,500 megabytes of storage. So as you can see, Windows XP actually requires twice the storage as the human genome. In computer terms, the human genome is stored in 6-bit combinations of information. The PlayStation 3 is 128 bits. Now, something really interesting is that the pufferfish, isn't it adorable, actually has no junk DNA, which is interesting because humans are actually made up of 95% junk DNA. So there are organisms out there that don't have any junk DNA whatsoever. Well, one thing that researchers are particularly interested in is finding out what is junk DNA and does it actually do anything? One recent study suggests that it really doesn't. Researchers took 2.3 million letters of DNA out of a mouse and compared it to a mouse with full-length version of DNA and found out that there are no differences whatsoever. So far, we've talked about the human genome size. Well, now we're going to talk about the actual number of genes that we have in our genome. And a gene is actually just a section of our overall genome that helps the body to know how to code for specific proteins within our body. So now we're going to talk about how many genes you have compared to the number of genes that other organisms have. Now, when scientists first started to study genetics in the human genome, we actually expected to find 3 times more the number of genes than we actually found, which is rather interesting because the 20 to 25,000 genes that we did find is only about twice the number that a roundworm has. And in fact, there's a variety of an amoeba that has 200 times the number of genes that a human being has. Now, when scientists first started studying the human genome, we thought that each gene coded for one protein. But actually, we have about 250,000 proteins being coded by 25,000 different genes, which means that each gene is coding for approximately 10 proteins, and scientists have no idea how this occurs. Now, as human beings, we always consider ourselves pretty complex compared to other organisms, but if we compare ourselves to coral, we actually have approximately the same number of genes as coral does. Now, you're probably thinking, I'm a human, I have to have a ton of genes, and we do. We have 20 to 25,000 genes, but you know what? A grain of rice actually has 40 to 50,000 genes. Can you imagine a little grain of rice has 50,000 genes and we have 25? What's up with that? As a matter of fact, many plants actually have more genes and much more complex genomes than many complex mammals. Now, fruit fly has about 13,500 genes. A nematode is going to have about 20,000. A human has in between 20 to 25,000 genes. A pufferfish has approximately 21,000 genes. Then we get to the thale crest, which has right about 25,500 genes. And then rice actually has 40 to 50,000 genes. And in fact, there's a variety of an amoeba that has 200 times the number of genes that a human being has. So now we're going to talk about the similarities of our genes compared to the genes of other organisms. Genes code for proteins, and as you can imagine, what our bones are made out of are probably going to be pretty similar to those of chimpanzees and even, say, fish. So our genes compared to, say, a chimpanzee is approximately 98% similar. We have about 98% of the same genes as the chimpanzees have. Now, what you may not know is that we are actually really similar to mice as well. In fact, 75% of our genes are in common with mice. Now, let's look at a dog. A dog's genetic sequence is actually about 85% similar to a human being's genetic sequence. Now, let's think about sea urchins. They're small, they're tiny, no bones. They don't really look anything like us, do they? Well, actually, compared to the human genes, they have 7,000 genes in common with us, which is approximately a quarter of all of our genes. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that humans have in between 20 to 25,000 genes. Now, let's think about how many unique genes they have compared to mice. Humans, in fact, only have 300 unique genes that mice don't have. So out of the 25,000 genes that we have, only 300 are not found in mice. Now, there are 113 genes that have been transferred from bacteria. Can you imagine? Bacteria! 113 of our genes are from bacteria. There are about 250 unique human genes that are not found in any lower species. In fact, scientists have not been able to find any evolutionary basis for these genes. There are about 250 unique human genes that are not found in any lower species. In fact, scientists have not been able to find any evolutionary basis for these genes. There are about 250 unique human genes that are not found in any lower species. In fact, scientists have not been able to find any evolutionary basis for these genes.
Human DNA is 99% identical to the DNA of chimpanzees. Unlike monkeys and other species who live in harmony with Earth's ecosystem, humans are at odds and out of step with nature. Why? Because part of us is foreign to this planet, and it is that foreign part of us that has brought the entire planet and all of its creatures to near extinction. According to Plato, the serpent god Poseidon was so pleased with the human hybrids he had engineered that he mated with a chosen female named Cleito and built a palace for her at the top of a hill near the center of the island. He surrounded it with rings of water and land to protect her. Cleito gave birth to 5 sets of twin boys. Eventually, he divided Atlantis into 10 districts, each ruled by one of his 10 demigod sons. For generations, humans lived among the gods and demigods and multiplied in great numbers. They lived simple, virtuous lives as laborers, but slowly they began to change as greed, power, and sexual immorality corrupted them. To determine a suitable punishment, Zeus gathered the assembly of gods together. In the Sumerian accounts, the gods decreed that a flood would sweep over the cult centers and destroy the corrupt seed of humans and demigods. Poseidon was sworn to secrecy about the plan.